watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I am one of your hosts here, Eugene Perrier, as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, great to be back with you.
It's great to be back on with you, Eugene. Happy Thursday. Wow.
I actually thought there
I
was going to be
really
some holiday I didn't know about. I was like, oh, what? I wasn't ready for that.
I like to keep you on your toes.
I mean, maybe there's a holiday in Lebanon. I don't know. I'm not up on that. If it's a holiday anywhere in the world, happy holidays to you, whoever you may be. And welcome to everyone else. Very happy to have you here. Obviously, we are covering a huge range of things, from the impact of sanctions, the legacy of the Soviet Union, the debt ceiling, Title 42 and immigration in the United States, right-wing politics in India, the very terrible ongoing situation right now in Gaza, Syria, and who knows what else we might even get into here on the show. So we've got a lot here for you. So as always, as we begin the show, this is a great time for you to let anyone else somehow, some way, who you know that we are here and we are live on YouTube. And of course, the Freedom Side Live is just a taste, if you will, of the varied offerings you can get from Breakthrough News. So you should hit the subscribe button and then also hit the bell so that you can be subscribed to all the fantastic content that we have, like Dispatches with Rania Khalek, and also get notified by YouTube. How handy is that when fantastic new things are coming out from us here at Breakthrough News? So it makes it very easy for you. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, get your air horns out, alert the neighborhood to the fact that the Freedom Side is live. And Rania, what else should people do?
Well, you can help support our journalism here at Breakthrough News by becoming patrons of Breakthrough News at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And if you do become a patron, you will have access to exclusive content, including Eugene's monthly seminar on Africa, the full episodes of my show, Dispatches. If you're a fan and you missed that second half and you want to keep seeing what's happening, become a patron. And of course, you can also donate, one-time donation at our website, breakthroughnews.org. And for those who are watching live, you can donate directly on YouTube. And for those who aren't watching live, you can also donate directly on YouTube. So that was a bit of a silly distinction. I take it back. All in all, most importantly, become a patron at patreon.com/Breakthrough News, and you can access exclusive content as well as help us grow.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Very important. Patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Subscribe, hit the bell. We are going to get right into it. And we want to start the show off today talking about the human consequences of economic sanctions. And that is also the title of a recent research paper by Francisco Rodríguez, our guest, who is a Venezuelan economist, professor of international and public affairs at the University of Denver, and the director and founder of Oil for Venezuela. Mr. Rodríguez, thank you so much for being with us here on the show. Oh, you might be muted. I don't know if that's your end or our end.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation.
Perfect. No, thank you so much. Really an honor to have you here. And your piece that appeared from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, Human Consequences of Economic Sanctions, comprehensive survey of pretty much everything that's out there on this issue. But before we jump into some of what you've learned about these human consequences, could you just give us a sense of the scale of how sanctions are really being used around the world?
Yes. Well, part of what I look at in that study has to do with the increase in the use of sanctions, and there's really quite a striking and remarkable increase. According to our calculations, at this moment, 27% of countries in the world are affected by sanctions, and 29% of world GDP is produced in countries that are affected by sanctions. And that's a huge increase in the past few decades. Just 20 years ago, these numbers were less than 10%. 40 years ago, they were less than 5%. So sanctions have become the instrument of choice of Western countries. They're using it essentially whenever there is an issue that they want to deal with in terms of foreign policy that a country is not doing what Western countries would like them to do. They're using sanctions. So now they're affecting a very large part of the global economy and of people in the world.
And in terms of like the actual damage they do on a more like countrywide level. We know that sanctions actually do end up leading to not just, devastating people's ability to like find work and devastating entire countries' economies, but also like to unnecessary death. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that's correct. So I looked at 32 studies, all the quantitative studies that have been published on the effect of sanctions using both cross-national data and country-specific data. Of those, 30 find consistent negative effects on living conditions ranging from per capita income, life expectancy, quality of life, malnutrition, stunting. Also, in terms of human rights, they lead to a deterioration of human rights. Some of the estimates indicate very large effects. So, for example, multilateral sanctions lead to a decline in income per capita of 26%. That is the equivalent of the Great Depression. They lead to a decline in life expectancy of 1.2 years for males and 1.4 years for females. That's the equivalent of the global effect on life expectancy of the COVID pandemic. They lead to increases in HIV rates and HIV rates among children, to increases in child mortality. Everywhere we look, where essentially the estimated effects are similar. If you impose sanctions on a country, economic sanctions in a country, the estimated effects are similar of those of that country becoming engaged in an armed conflict.
Wow. I mean, that's wow. Those are amazing numbers. And I mean, we've seen some of the countries that you highlight in the report. Of course, well, they're all in the news quite a bit, but Venezuela, and you are Venezuelan, is obviously really at the heart of a lot of the discussion around sanctions, because there's a bit of a back and forth between the U.S. government and the Venezuelan government about what the real impact of sanctions has been on the Venezuelan economy. Having looked at the data, what can you tell us about that?
Yes. Oh, it's very clear that they've had an impact. Now, that doesn't mean that they are the only cause of Venezuela's economic crisis. Generally, economic crises are complex phenomena. They're multi-causal. There are many factors that impact on them. We know that the Venezuelan economy was very poorly managed during several years. We know that the country had a large oil boom, which it didn't use well, so it wasn't prepared when oil prices started declining. It wasn't prepared to handle that decline. So there's definitely a policy component. But we also know that when oil prices started recovering, the economy wasn't able to actually enjoy the higher revenues from those oil prices because oil production started declining. And there's a lot of work identifying the effect. I have a recent paper in the Latin American Economic Review measuring the effects of sanctions on oil production. And sanctions are a key contributor, if not the primary contributor, to a decline in oil production. And what you have to understand about the Venezuelan economy is that oil it accounts for 95% of the country's foreign currency revenue. And oil revenues went down by 93% during the past 10 years. So obviously, if you take an economy and you take its only source of revenue away, then the economy is going to collapse. Venezuela has seen the largest decline ever observed in GDP per capita in a country outside of wartime. It's a 72% contraction in GDP per capita. And it's also seen, as a result of those deteriorating economic conditions, the largest migration exodus ever seen in the Western Hemisphere. In all of those phenomena, there is decisively a very significant impact of economic sanctions on the country.
Yeah, I just want to point out, you in the paper you write, the collapse in Venezuela's oil production is of a dimension that we only see when armies blow up oil fields. That's a really, I think, important and stunning way to put it, because sanctions the word sounds so harmless, right? Like oftentimes sanctions, we know in like the way that they're covered in US media, it's often in this way where they're actually not even mentioned. I shouldn't even say US media. In the US media, oftentimes we hear, oh, the Venezuelan economy is suffering because of like mismanagement and just Maduro's evil, or in Iran, like the regime is evil and just mismanagement and corruption. And the word sanctions might appear like in the 12th paragraph one time or something as like a side note, if even. But I want to get to the issue of, like, what you're talking about is not an accident, right? This is an intended form of punishment for countries the US does not like for this or that reason. So can you talk a little bit about that, I guess maybe push back a bit against the narrative we often hear from US politicians, which is that sanctions are intended to like punish specific leaders so we can actually help the people of Venezuela or help the people of Iran. When from what you're saying, it sounds like the effects of sanctions are diametrically opposed to any idea of like democracy or freedom or helping the average person in these countries.
Yes. In the case of Venezuela, as well as in the case of Iran, sanctions were very clearly designed to hurt the country's oil industry. So they were very clearly designed to get at the heart of the economy. And in that sense, there isn't really a consistent claim that can be made that they were only targeted at wrongdoers. And there's a very interesting distinction here between the approach that the United States has taken and the approach that the European Union has taken. So the European Union has said, we're only going to target government officials and people linked to the government, but we're not going to target the Venezuelan economy because we don't want to aggravate Venezuela's economic crisis. But the US, in contrast, and this began with the Trump administration's maximum pressure approach, they explicitly targeted the Venezuelan economy. And even John Bolton, when he was national security advisor, when he was announcing the imposition of sanctions, he very clearly said this is going to take away $11 billion in annual revenue from the Venezuelan government. So in that sense, I think that there's really no discussion that there was an aim to hurt the Venezuelan economy. Well, the consequences are as expected. They aggravated a humanitarian crisis, and they've led to a significant drop in income per capita, significant growing scarcity of imported inputs for agriculture, of imported agricultural goods, of food, of medicines. All of those are essentially part of the design of sanctions on Venezuela.
You know, one of the things that you mentioned vis-a-vis Afghanistan in the paper, which I thought was interesting, and of course this is another country, you know, majorly in the news on this issue, is the role of non-recognition of a government as almost like a de facto sanction. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yes, and we've started to see that. We've seen that in the case of the Taliban. We also see it in the case of Venezuela, where the U.S. recognized an alternate government headed by an opposition leader and gave it control over the country's assets abroad. In the case of Afghanistan, the U.S. government essentially froze $5 billion in the country's central bank reserves. And what we have to understand is that an economy can't really, in a developing country, can't really function without a central bank. And that central bank issues currency, but that currency only has value if it is backed by assets such as dollars, such as international reserves. So when you take away the access to international reserves, you're really striking at the capacity of the economy to function. And the main reason in both cases, the main reason given is not one of sanctions. I mean, sanctions exist. There are sanctions against the Taliban. There are sanctions against the Maduro government. But what is being used to freeze access to these reserves is non-recognition. It's the idea that when representatives, be it of the Taliban or be it of the Maduro government, want to have access to those sanctions, they tell them, no, you're not the legitimate government. You're not recognized legally. And we see that, for example, in the case of the UK, which does not have economic sanctions on Venezuela, but nevertheless, there's $2 billion in gold reserves of Venezuela's central bank. The country tried to use it to buy vaccines in the middle of the pandemic. The response of the Bank of England and the response of the British government was, no, you can't have access to that because you are not the recognized government. So when a government like the US, like the UK says, you're not the recognized government, you're de facto freezing access to all bank accounts of the government, and you're freezing access to international, to any means of international finance. And any government in the world, any economy in the world needs to be able to process transactions through the US financial system, because any transactions in dollars, any major transactions in dollars are processed through US banks. So when you do that, you are severely weakening the capacity of authorities in those countries to run their economy.
I think it's incredible that at this point, something like you mentioned, that 27% of countries around the world are now targets of U.S. Of U.S. sanctions, which is basically like a third of the world at this point. But one thing I was kind of blown away by, not that I have a hard time believing this, is that the Biden administration has made expansive use of this weapon. imposing more sanctions per year than even Trump, who of course had far outdone the Barack Obama administration. But I'm just curious, because I was surprised by that. I always thought that Biden had just continued with Trump's sanctions and then added some more here and there. Where does that come from, the fact that he's even using them more than Trump did?
Well, to a certain extent, it comes from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So if
Okay.
you look at 2021, then it wasn't clear that there was going to be a trend of increase. I mean, there were some other cases like Myanmar where they were imposing, but they were also taking back some sanctions. But when Russia invaded Ukraine, then there was a big surge in the use of sanctions. But there's also a very important, much more difficult to measure, but a very important increase in the use of what are known as secondary sanctions, which are extraterritorial use of sanctions by the U.S. This is where the U.S. says, well, I cannot stop, say, Indian companies from buying oil from Iran because I have no jurisdiction over either Iranian territory or Indian territory. But if I learn that an Indian company is buying Iranian oil, then I am going to sanction that Indian company. And generally that threat has been enough to dissuade purchases in many countries from interacting with a sanctioned country. So even though the U.S. is the country that's imposing most of these sanctions, their reach goes way beyond the U.S. economy. The U.S. is the dominance of the dollar in international financial markets essentially allows the U.S. to replicate the effects of global trade embargoes on the countries that it's sanctioning.
And let me just ask you this quickly before we let you go. What were you able to learn, if anything, in your research about the role of these licenses? Because, of course, the U.S. government is always making the point when these issues are raised about human consequences. Oh, well, we have all these licenses, so if it's really about medicine or food, there's actually no problem or no impact.
Yeah, I mean, the licenses exist. They are very rarely used because financial institutions don't want to carry out transactions with a sanctioned country. Basically, what happens is that the burden of proof is on the financial institution, it's on the banks. So the Treasury Department will say, if you inadvertently process a transaction, say for one of the cronies of the Assad regime, then we're going to fine you. But how exactly does a bank figure out if somebody who's asking to process a transaction from Syria is a crony of the Assad regime? It's not like there's a public database where they can find that out. So banks usually say, well, I'd rather not process transactions from Syria. And in fact, you had a very interesting and striking example of this when the earthquake in February hit Turkey and Syria, and many aid organizations and activists tried to start campaigns to collect funds for Syria relief, and GoFundMe actually froze the accounts of anybody who was requesting access and who was trying to collect funds for Syria earthquake relief because it was afraid that it would get sanctioned by the U.S. government if it processed those transactions. The U.S. actually did issue a very specific, much broader license for Syria earthquake relief, but the fact that they had to issue it, despite the fact that there were already humanitarian exceptions in place, shows you that those humanitarian exceptions don't work. And of all of the other countries that are sanctioned in the world, there are 54 countries, so there are 53 countries other than Syria, or there are aims of humanitarian aid which go beyond this very time-bound earthquake exception that are not favored by the U.S. policy, by the recent U.S. policy. So this is a case where the exception very clearly proves the rule that humanitarian exceptions, as laid out by the U.S. in most cases, are just simply ineffective.
Mm-hmm. The human consequences of economic sanctions. Those of you who are watching can find that at cepr.net, cepr.net. Francisco Rodríguez, thank you so much for joining us here on The Freedom Side.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Eugene, I want to mention just on
Please.
that last note before we move to the next topic that with regard to the sanctions on Syria and that general license that was issued as like a humanitarian exception by the U.S. Treasury Department, I know people who work for organizations in Syria, and I've been told that exception has not made much of a difference on the ground. And in one case, the Caesar sanctions that the U.S. has in place on Syria prohibit rebuilding materials to prevent Syria from rebuilding buildings that were destroyed in the war. And so in the case of the earthquake, this person's organization has has like been trying to procure stuff to rebuild what was destroyed in the earthquake. And companies have been saying, you need to prove that this was destroyed in the earthquake and not in the war, or else we cannot sell you this. And point being that you can't prove it, right? Like rubble from an earthquake and rubble from a war look very similar. And I mean, unless you've got photos from just before the earthquake showing a building standing, it's really, really difficult to prove that. Essentially, this general license hasn't meant much is my point of raising that. It's pretty brutal.
No, very important point. Very important point. Well, just a couple days ago, May 9th was Victory Day, which is celebrated around the world for the victory of the Allied forces against Nazi Germany in World War II. And certainly the Soviet Union was certainly the principal fighter there in that conflict and played the principal role in terms of bearing the brunt and fighting the Nazi war machine. So brought many of those issues back into focus here. And to talk more about all of this, we are very happy to be joined here on the show by Carlos Martinez, who's an author and activist and the co-editor of Friends of Socialist China. Carlos, thanks so much for being back with us.
Hey guys, good afternoon. Good to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you. And of course, I will just plug this here, The End of the Beginning, about the history of the Soviet Union there, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse by Carlos Martinez. You can get that here in the U.S. at 1804books.com. But, very important issue because, you raised this in the beginning of your book that the Soviet Union has many world historic achievements to its name, one of which being the Soviet legacy in World War II. And I was hoping we could just start there because especially here in the United States, this is a completely untold story. All we hear about is D-Day, essentially.
Yeah, that's right. Well, if you look at the map of Europe in 1942, right, you've got practically the whole of continental Europe. It's occupied by the Nazis or it's occupied by Nazi allies. Britain, where I am, was saved only by, the helpful existence of the English Channel. And it was the Soviet Union principally working with the partisan movements in Europe that defeated the Nazis. We don't talk about that. It's not fashionable to talk about that. It's not even, in high school history curriculums, that's not taught. In Britain, we seem to think World War II was won by a slightly chaotic evacuation of Dunkirk. In the US, you think that it was the Americans getting involved at the last minute, rushing troops to Western Europe to prevent France and Italy from going communist, that was some kind of crucial determining factor in the war. Of course it wasn't. It was the heroism of the Soviet Union, which lost 27 million people in the struggle to defeat fascism. And, I think it's worth saying on this program that victory was a victory for the socialist system, not just, a massive country. It wasn't just a victory for people's kind of patriotism and nationalist feeling. It was a victory for socialism, for rapid industrialization, for the kind of consolidation of forces and energy and economic resources at a scale that would have just been inconceivable under capitalism. Like, can you even imagine that kind of preparation under the Tsarist regime? Factories were built to be mobile such that when faced with invasion from the West, they were literally shifted east so that production could continue throughout the war. And it was also, I think, a victory for the socialist system in the sense that working people, ordinary people, the masses, the vast majority of the population truly felt they had something to fight for. If you compare the fate of the Soviet Union and its actions in that war with what happened in France or what happened in Holland or Belgium or Hungary or any number of other countries, those countries' national armies collapsed in a question of days and weeks and months, right? The Soviet Union kept fighting and furthermore won, right? So this is a big part of that, is that people were in a society that was built for them, something that working people had never had before, there or anywhere else. And they were able to make extraordinary sacrifices to defend it. And, the whole thing has a certain tragic but important resonance today in the context of what's going on in Ukraine, right? Because where so much of the fighting is taking place now in the Donbass region, that's the same towns, the same cities, the same villages, that so much of that incredibly intense fighting took place in the Second World War. Yeah, and at that time it was Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians fighting together against a fascist enemy. And now we've got this tragic twist, this tragic inversion because the Ukrainian paramilitaries who've been fighting on the front line in the Donbass against ethnic Russian people for the last 9 years are literally neo-Nazis. You know, we talk about celebrating Victory Day, and we think of the heroism of the Soviet people. You can't even celebrate that in Ukraine under kind of decommunization laws. You know, the Soviet war memorials have been pulled down and replaced by statues of Stepan Bandera, who was a literal fascist. So these people, you know, the Azov battalion, the right sector and so on, they've been recast as nationalists, but they're fascists, they're white supremacists, they're anti-Semites. So, you know, all of this, you know, the Victory Day is a very important reminder of the success of the Soviet Union, as you've said, but also of what the Soviet Union and the anti-fascist peoples of the world fought for in that period.
You know, Carlos, something that I learned a lot growing up in the United States whenever the issue of World War II came up is that if it wasn't for America, we'd all be speaking German. And so would all of Europe. Like, that's a constant. I mean, you know that too, Eugene. I'm sure you heard that at some point in school growing up and just from like random ignorant people. But another aspect of all of this that I think is very much connected to what you just mentioned about Ukraine today and the fact that NATO is basically supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine to do some of like the frontline fighting there against Russia is when we go back and we talk about Soviet history. I mean, part of the rise of fascism was, you know, a result of wanting of people who could fight against communists, like the US and the UK and these capitalist countries were okay with Hitler until they weren't. Can you talk a little bit about that history of the rise of fascism and the fact that it was like allowed to proliferate and in some cases encouraged? Like we always hear about, oh, Stalin made a deal with Hitler. We never really learn about, you know, the West's role, the capitalist West's role in the rise of Hitler and other fascists.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Fascism historically has always arisen as a response to a combination of a crisis of capitalism. And if you think about the 1920s, 1930s, capitalism faced the biggest, most significant and substantial crisis that it's faced to date, you know, in its history. And furthermore, a rise of an alternative ideology, an ideology of the working class, i.e. communism, socialism, Marxism, which was gaining strength massively. And there's no question that the ruling classes in Europe and the US, to a degree, supported the rise of Mussolini, supported the rise of Hitler, supported the rise of Franco. You know, the Spanish Civil War is a perfectly good test case for that, because what side were the Americans on in the Spanish Civil War? What side were the British on? You know, they didn't side with the Democrats. They didn't side with the Republicans. You know, they couldn't say it clearly because they had to maintain their posture as Democrats. But the fact is, they prevented any supplies from going to the Republican side, and they didn't do anything about the supplies that were going from Germany and Italy to the nationalists, to the fascist side. So all through that period, right up until the end of the 1930s, it was the clear aim and strategy of the Western powers, led by Britain, that Hitler should be leveraged against the Soviet Union. You know, the whole process of kind of pacification and accepting what Hitler was doing in Poland and Czechoslovakia and elsewhere was about, let's appease Hitler, let's give him what he wants, and let's just encourage him to go east and to fight against the Soviet Union. And then those two can exhaust each other. We'll kill two birds with one stone. And you know, it's very controversial to say so, but that strategy was ultimately defeated by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. You know, if it hadn't been for that pact, that would have been the trajectory of geopolitics in the late 1930s. Germany would have gone to war against the Soviet Union in 1939, and the Soviet Union would have lost 2.5 years of preparation, which proved to be absolutely crucial in the trajectory of that war.
Yeah, I mean it's really an amazing history, and of course they never tell us how the Soviet Union was desperately trying to work with the West, and only ended up where they were in 1939 because of the inability there. But huge piece. But one of the other things I want to get to as well, and you've already sort of alluded this to a degree, the unique aspects of the Soviet Union that allowed them to resist, central planning in particular. And I was hoping you could just talk a little bit more about what the Soviets were able to do in their society by planning it rather than just leaving it to the market as we do here in the capitalist West these days.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important for socialists and leftists to study the Soviet Union and to kind of own that experience, because apart from anything else, it had some stunning successes. We're always told that socialism doesn't work, right? And we're told that the Soviet Union was a failure, that it was a authoritarian, miserable type of society. But actually, any serious analysis of history just doesn't bear that out at all. For one thing, the peoples of the territories of the Soviet Union experienced an absolutely unprecedented improvement in their living standards. Feudalism was wiped out, which is not a small thing, right? The Soviet Union emerged from being a pretty backward, compared to Western Europe, compared to North America. Russia at that time was a backward state. And within a couple of decades, it was a superpower. It was one of two superpowers. It was the second biggest economy in the world. It became a global leader in multiple areas of science and technology. It became a pioneer in arts and culture. For the first time in Russian history, famine stopped being a problem. The Soviet Union built the first comprehensive welfare state, the first country to have free education at all levels, the first country to have free healthcare and a guarantee of housing available to everyone. Universal literacy was achieved in a matter of 2 decades. It was even, and this is, I think, really surprising to a lot of people, the USSR was a trailblazer on gender equality. Where did women first get the right to vote? Where did they first get freedom to divorce? Where did they first get, the right to abortion and bodily autonomy? What country was it that innovated on childcare provision and socialization of domestic labor? It was the Soviet Union. Actually, this is an interesting statistic. By the 1970s, there were more female doctors in the Soviet Union than in the whole, rest of the world combined. It was an affirmative action state. It was an anti-racist state. Racial and ethnic discrimination were banned, were made punishable offenses long before that was the case in the US or Britain. At that time, in the 1930s, African Americans faced what in the United States? Lynching and segregation. So you had very important civil rights leaders and Black American activists, such as W.B. Du Bois or Paul Robeson or Langston Hughes, going to the Soviet Union and saying things like, this is the first place that I've been, that I'm treated with dignity and respect as a human being. The unemployment problem was solved. Capitalism still hasn't found a way to solve the unemployment problem or the housing problems. But in the Soviet Union, they were solved in, humanity's very first socialist experiment, right? And as we've been talking about, fascism was defeated. They built a country that was sufficiently strong, sufficiently advanced, united, and determined that it could defeat the Nazi armies. And, Victory Day, as I say, is a reminder of that, of how much humanity owes the Soviet people and how much they contributed to creating the world that we live in today.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there we go. I lost you for a second there, Carlos. You are back with us now, but I really appreciate this. Sorry, Ronnie, did I cut you off?
No, I was just cheering for the little box rearrangement.
Yes.
That just took place,
absolutely crucial. Well, Carlos, as always, we really appreciate you having you with us. I just have to plug it again. The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse. Whether you know a lot or a little about the Soviet Union, I'm telling you, this book is fascinating, very important. You should study it. You should read it. You can get it from Left Word Books. And if you're in the U.S., you can go to 1804books.com and you can get it from there. And the footnotes, I will say, are also an excellent guide to Soviet history. So as always, Carlos Martinez, really appreciate having you with us. Friends of Socialist China, also couldn't recommend it any higher. Thanks for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much. See you soon.
Really is a great little book. Into the beginning. Just
Little.
gonna plug it again.
We were joking before we started the show that Eugene should just hold it up the whole interview, like in front of your face. I was waiting for you to do it. I was like, wow, he put that book down real fast.
Yeah, no, great, and great insights too into why the Soviet Union collapsed. It's an important issue, and I think if you check out Friends of Socialist China project that Carlos works on, talks a lot about the socialist experiences that are going on today, and what some of the people learned from some of those lessons. So really appreciate that. We want to keep yes.
Well, wait, I know we want to keep the show moving, but first I have to shame our viewers,
please,
because I see that there's 130 people watching. However, I only see 71 likes on the YouTube little thumbs up thing. So I'm going to remind you guys to go ahead and press that like button. I see it going up a little bit, because if there's 130 of you watching and only 72 have pressed like, we've got a bit of a discrepancy there. But more importantly, it helps us in the algorithm against the big evil secret algorithm that doesn't let us be as big as CNN or the Colbert Report, which for some reason is constantly being fed to me, even though I don't follow it.
I know. Well, that's why I never sign in with my account, so that they can't try to manipulate me by tracking.
That's how you become a liberal.
Speak for yourself. I'm reading about the Soviet Union, so I'm not a liberal. Let's just keep that together. Anyway, long story short, to move on to discussing what liberals and conservatives are doing here in the U.S. political spectrum, we want to turn to the issue of the debt ceiling debate here in the United States, and we are very happy to be joined by Walter Smolarek, editor of Liberation News, author of a recent article, I forgot to have my tab up, but a great recent article about the debt ceiling debate on Liberation News. Walter, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Well, I
think I know the title.
What's that? Please.
I think I know the title. Is it Will Biden Reward Right-Wing Blackmail and Debt Ceiling Talks?
That's
mark?
it.
That's the title. That's it.
Yeah.
Perfect.
There you go. It's a good title. It was worth intervening there. Go ahead, Eugene.
No, it is. Well, Walter, I always hate to assume that people know everything. So let's just maybe start here. What is the debt ceiling and why are we talking about it?
Sure. So the debt ceiling is a completely manufactured fake crisis. In 1917, there was a bill passed that limited the amount of money that the U.S. federal government is allowed to borrow. Periodically, generally every year or two, it's raised. For many, many decades, this was something that people didn't really even think about. It was just a matter, of course, every couple of years, Congress is going to pass an increase in the debt ceiling limit, right? This has happened scores of times. But what's taken place essentially since the Tea Party wave in 2010 is that right-wing politicians periodically decide to use the expiration of the debt limit, right? The need to pass legislation to raise the debt limit as political leverage to force massive social spending cuts. That's really what's at the core of this, trying to get rid of what little social safety net exists, shred those programs that are on the books by depriving them of funding, and to essentially, hold a gun to the head of the economy, quote unquote, by saying, well, look, the U.S. will make the U.S. federal government default on its debt, which would have cascading economic problems, unless these attacks are carried through against working people.
And then that brings us to the issue of the role of Democrats here, because oftentimes, and I mean, since the Obama days, even when the Republicans started to very strategically use this issue to get their way and to hold the government hostage, since the Obama days, Democrats have often tried to portray themselves as the defenders of the working class, we're here to make sure that Republicans don't get what they want. And that's what Biden is doing right now, right? He's promoting himself as the opposition to these big bad Republicans, which, okay, great. But is that really true, Walter?
No, it's completely false. I mean, Joe Biden has been on the sides of the big banks and corporations and billionaires his entire career. That hasn't changed since he's taken office. I mean, Biden's also done his part to shred the social safety net. There was an expansion. I mean, ironically, it happened under Trump. There was an expansion of social programs because of the pandemic. Over the course of 2020, it became easier to get access to food stamps, to be enrolled in Medicaid and stay enrolled in Medicaid. There was a nationwide moratorium on evictions. I mean, Biden has presided over the shredding of all of that. Those could all have become permanent programs. They were very, very popular, and it would have made Biden very popular too. But he doesn't. He didn't do it. He doesn't want to do it. And so this posture is like, I'm the only thing standing between, the devastation that the Republicans will wreak on working families and, the alternative. Like, he's not the alternative. He's taking part in this too. It also seems that he could offer concessions, right? Like, the Republicans have passed this legislation in the House that would impose like gigantic across the board budget cuts. There's a lot of complicated internal dynamics within the Republican Party, but there's certainly a scenario where we could see Biden agreeing to some parts of that plan in exchange for votes to raise the debt ceiling. So the fact that he's agreed to now begin negotiations with Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell and other leaders of the Senate and the House is an indication that he's open to something like that. Now Biden is saying, okay, well, look, these talks, they're not about the debt ceiling. They're just about the federal budget, which we've got to pass next year anyway. So I'm not rewarding their blackmail. I'm not rewarding their hostage taking. I'm just having a conversation about the federal budget and potential deficit reduction measures. That's purely semantics. That has no actual substantive difference, because what the Republicans are seeking is reductions in the budgets allocated to social programs. So they're just using semantics to try to get away from the fact that they're actually perfectly willing to sit down with Republicans and hammer out how they're going to screw over working people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it really quite the situation, and well, this is a number of things I want to say, but maybe this is the most important one. When we were talking about the issue, or have been continually talking about the issue of the filibuster, since the Biden administration has come in, one of the things that people have pointed out is if we really wanted to fight, there are various novel theories that are out there that you could put on the table. Is that the same thing here with the debt ceiling, and what attitude has Biden taken towards, if there are any particular sort of maneuvers or workarounds that he could try? Because of course the way it's presented in the media is sort of like, well, there's no alternative. Republicans control the House, Democrats control the Senate, so like, what are you going to do? They have to negotiate, as if there's no sort of forward position that Biden could take.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most prominent example of that is a clause of the 14th Amendment, which was one of the amendments passed in the aftermath of the Civil War. So there's a language in the 14th Amendment that essentially says, even though it was passed in a different time period, maybe a different context, the language is totally clear. Like the U.S. government shall pay its debt, right? Like there is like a constitutional mandate for the U.S. government to pay back the loans that it takes out, to make payments on its debt. So what Biden could say is like, okay, well, look, if you're going to say to the country, like, carry out these dramatically unpopular social spending cuts, or we're going to tank the economy, we're going to make the U.S. government default on its debt and maybe tip the world economy into recession, he could say like, well, I'm just gonna let's fight it out in court. I'm going to just pay the debt. I'm just going to keep doing it because the Constitution says that I have to. And if you want to take me to court and try to get the Supreme Court to essentially impose a default on the U.S. government, like, be my guest. If you want to commit political suicide like that, be my guest. That would be a strong fighting orientation that I think would actually galvanize a lot of public support behind him. But he is not going to do it. He raised the possibility of the 14th Amendment. There's, I think, divided opinion within the administration, but it's not the kind of fighting offensive posture that would actually stand a chance at beating back the Republicans.
Walter, when we talk about the cuts that Republicans want, I'm sure we're talking about like what, maybe cuts to like the massive military industry, or perhaps I'm sure they're asking for cuts to the things we really spend money on, like that massive border apparatus that we have. Okay, I'll stop before everybody starts thinking I'm not joking. But no, I raise all that to say, what are the cuts that are on the table? You said unpopular cuts to spending programs that are like actually help people. What are we talking about here? What's at risk?
Yeah, well, that's a good point about what's being exempted, right? Because it would be 18% caps on or a cap on spending that, because of inflation, would actually effectively be an 18% cut to like every government department. But subsequently, different Republican leaders have come out and said, "Oh, no, not the military. Oh no, not the Department of Homeland Security. They do things that we
Never.
like. They brutalize
Hmm.
immigrants. And so if you do exempt those plus the Department of Veterans Affairs to meet these, the spending cap, right? They would have to essentially cut the budget of all other departments in half. So this would be huge. It would be dramatic. It would also include imposing, quote unquote, work requirements on food stamps and on Medicaid, which it really just means like a whole lot of confusing bureaucracy that's designed to screw people out of the benefits that they are actually legally entitled to by making it really confusing to get it. And they also want to reverse the student loan forgiveness policy that the administration rolled out. Which is also being challenged in the Supreme Court. So terrible, unpopular things. It's really remarkable that Biden is not taking more of a fighting orientation around this.
It really is remarkable, and I mean the other remarkable thing here is that Kevin McCarthy was able to pass this one bill, but of course as the negotiations go on, significant elements, and you've already referenced this to some degree, Walter, in the Republican caucus actually think that cutting every department by half is not enough, and that in fact more should be done. So it seems very likely in a way that if Biden is to negotiate here, the end point will end up actually even worse probably than what McCarthy has actually proposed, because as I've seen some of these Republicans say, this is our only chance to impose anything. And so it seems like even though they were willing to give him some votes for this kind of cosmetic thing, when we really get down to the nitty-gritty, it could actually be worse than that.
Yeah, and I mean, if we step back for a second and look at this from the point of view of the breakdown of the basic state institutions in the United States, like the functioning of the government apparatus of this most powerful capitalist empire in the world, like it is absurd that this is how it works. Like this is how the U.S. government pays its debts, right? There's like these near misses every few years because essentially a very small handful of ultra right wing politicians have so much leverage. I mean, that's not the only reason. Of course, the bulk of the political elite would like to do a lot of these things. But in this particular situation, yeah, it's certainly true that because the Republican majority in the House is so narrow, the most unbelievably extreme right-wing people like Marjorie Taylor Greene or the guy in Florida, the congressman from Florida, who's Matt Gaetz. Yeah. They have all of this all of this influence because they're, essentially if they can keep their little block of a handful of far right wingers together, they're like the kingmakers. And so Kevin McCarthy is not just, negotiating with Biden, seeing what he can get Biden to agree to. He's also has to keep in mind, like, okay, what can I actually keep these people on side for? So it's really, kind of a systemic or structural paralysis that they find themselves in.
No, for sure.
I have one question before we wrap up here for Walter, and that is, and this might be a tough one because I think sometimes when it comes to this issue, which comes up every however many years, we see the issue of debt ceiling. A lot of Americans, your eyes kind of glaze over because what does that mean? And it's a lot of technical language. And it feels like one of those issues where like we have no power because there's these two, like parties that pretend they're at odds, but aren't really. And like, they're the ones deciding in these closed door meetings and these negotiations. What can we do? Like, is there anything we can do as this sort of thing takes place to, push back against the attempt to cut these very important programs that people depend on for like their survival?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the overall answer to that is like build an independent fighting force that can actually represent the interests of working people. Because as long as Biden is the best that we have, the Democrats are the best that we have, like it's not going to work out well, right? Because they're not actually on our side at the end of the day. They're on the side of the Wall Street donors, the corporate executives that bankroll their campaigns, that go to the same country clubs that they do, that send their kids to the same private schools. There actually has to be an independent fighting force that would change the calculations. It certainly can seem like this. The outcome of the debt ceiling debate is just going to be determined by calculations made by powerful politicians, and we're not part of their calculations. But independent organization, grassroots fighting movements, that can really change the calculus.
Mm-hmm. Walter Smolarek, editor of Liberation News, also author of an excellent recent article on the debt ceiling. As always, really appreciate you joining us here on The Freedom Side.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kevin McCarthy. When's he going to find the time to get those spray tans working to keep his caucus on side? Sorry, I had no choice. It's just too obvious. If you're watching this, Kevin McCarthy, I'm sorry, bro. I know you're trying to, not look like a pasty old white guy, but it's a little too obvious. Understandable, but
Called
too obvious.
out.
Yeah.
Called out.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting. I've actually got a little challenge for our chat here since we were talking about Biden, if he's the best. There's a video circulating on the internet right now on Twitter that I feel super confident is fake and not real, but I wonder if any of our viewers can research this. It's a video of someone whispering in Biden's ear, like reminding him he's in the U.S. Capitol and saying that he's headed the wrong way to the wrong exit. I feel so strongly that it's fake and that it's like some sort of AI deep fake, but I wasn't able to find out anything when I was looking into it. But if there's any intrepid viewer who can look into this and let us know if this is real or fake, I would greatly appreciate if you could clear that up for us.
I feel like if it was real, we would have seen like commentary on it from like Elon Musk and also like every right-wing media outlet out there. Like the Daily Wire would have been all over it.
You'd
Fox
think so.
News
If it's fake, I have to say, if you've seen this video and you know what I'm talking about, if it's fake, it does show like how scary a lot of this like AI and everything. I mean, it's like it's deep.
Are we AI? What if this is deep fake? What if we're not really who we say we are right now? This is all completely artificial intelligence generated.
I've actually been talking to some people who work in AI, and it's actually scary how easy it would be to use AI to totally fake this show.
Wow.
Yeah, we're going into some dangerous territory, man. Listen, technology is only as good as who controls it. And right now, the only people who control AI are people who just want to make huge sums of money and do not care what the impact of AI is going to be in our society. And like so many technologies that we've seen over the years, there's, big thing. I mean, nuclear power was at one time, of course, the huge rage. And it was like, there's nothing wrong with it. It's all fine. And then you start having nuclear reactors melt down. It's like, oh my God. At one time, cigarettes, of course. They used to say cigarettes were good for your health.
Yeah.
There's so many things that
they were torches. They were torches of freedom. That's it. No, seriously. They were torches of freedom for women. It was like to liberate you.
My dad started smoking in 1948, and I asked him like what was like the craziest thing they said back then when he started smoking. He was like, yeah, they used to say that when you would start like hacking coughing after you'd been smoking for 20 years, it was good because you were getting all the like bad stuff out of your lungs. So cigarettes were helping you.
Wow.
I know.
Wow.
I know.
Well, speaking of AI, and this is a good segue into the topic we're about to discuss. Okay. I saw this these screenshots of somebody asking ChatGPT two very similar questions, the same question with just a slight difference. One was, do Palestinians deserve to be free? And the response was like, that's a very complicated question. And it's a very complex topic. And then the next prompt was, do Israelis deserve to be free? And it was like, of course, like all people anywhere in the world, Israelis deserve to be free. Wow. And it's like, wow, like how is ChatGPT that bad on Israel Palestine unless it's like algorithm is built to be?
Yeah, and also because it draws, like, that's what people don't understand. It draws from existing information. So when there's huge imbalances in the information that's available, I mean, that's why it'll say these. Anyway, let's not get into ChatGPT. Let's actually segue into what you were trying to do, which is that Gaza, which continues to be under siege.
The answer, in case ChatGPT is listening or watching, is that Palestinians do, in fact, deserve to be free. And currently, about over 2 million of them living in the Gaza Strip are not. It is the most densely populated place in the world, and Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip are essentially living in an open-air prison where Israel controls the air, land, and sea borders, and also prevents Palestinians from leaving or coming in, and is currently bombing the Gaza Strip once again, has killed, as last we saw, Eugene, I think it was 28 people, including at least like 5 children and at least 5 women. A lot of this has been the Israelis, I believe, doing what they do every so often, which is what they call, in very disgusting fashion, mowing the lawn. This is a term the Israelis actually use to refer to every few years going and cutting down the grass in Gaza to like take the resistance forces there down a notch so that they're never able to increase their deterrent capacity. So anyways, it's been really horrible. I believe at least one Israeli has died in the responding rocket attacks from the Gaza Strip, which as usual, have been quite impressive in the sense that, Gaza, again, open air prison. Israel controls all of the borders except, Egypt, of course, controls that small border in the south in collaboration with the Israelis. But it's very difficult to get things in and out of the Gaza Strip. So a lot of the weaponry they have in there, it's not the sophisticated sort of weaponry that Israel gets from the U.S. to the tune of over $3 billion, of almost $4 billion a year. That is weapons that you can supposedly use to actually target what you want to target. These rockets are mostly homemade. And then, of course, the only condemnations you'll hear whenever this happens from Western officials are if any damage is done to the Israeli side. And so we've seen condemnations of, the Palestinians need to stop lobbing rockets at Israel, blah, blah, blah. Israel has a right to defend itself. Apparently, Palestinians, according to these people, do not. And so far, I think at least 3 or maybe more, maybe up to 5 different commanders or people in senior leadership of Islamic Jihad, which is one of the resistance groups in Gaza, have been assassinated in this bombing campaign, many of them alongside families. So yeah, it's really brutal. Another act of mowing the lawn. And of course, this is happening as well on, today is an important day. It's the 1-year anniversary of the murder of Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, Palestinian American, for whom there has been no accountability or justice whatsoever. And it does, after many investigations last year, it did appear as though she had been intentionally targeted by Israeli soldiers while covering an Israeli raid in the West Bank. So I'll let you take it from there, Eugene.
Well, I thought you touched on it.
I could go on.
About 292 individuals have been prevented from accessing medical treatment because the border crossings are blocked, of course, and many of those, according to human rights groups, are cancer patients who would have been traveling to receive their treatment. So, that's another group of people who could potentially die because they were unable to access their treatment. 29 Palestinians have now been killed, unfortunately, 90 injured. The Palestinian Health Ministry reporting that includes 6 children, 3 women, and 2 elderly people. And of course, we know that these numbers will always continue to rise, especially after the bombing stops, whenever that is, and rescue forces are able to do a thorough search of the rubble. Wafa Al-Udaini, who we had on the show a couple weeks ago, has shared a couple pretty brutal videos, quite frankly, of young kids and the impact. A young girl who's calling for, her parents, one of whom is dead, and of course, who she'll never see again. But, of course, they're not going to tell a young kid that right there. And I hope people actually go back and listen to the interview we did with Wafa, because she herself is a mother, and she talks about the impact on her kids, the impact on herself of trying to, find a way to basically keep your kids from knowing what's really going on in reality. But I think the point you made about the 1 Israeli killed compared to 29 Palestinians, I wish I had the exact numbers, but that's basically the story of the whole conflict, how you have huge numbers of Palestinians who have been killed over this period, and comparatively almost no Israelis. There might be some people who criticize me for that, but when you look at some people at Bet Salem used to have this graph that they would put out about that was just shocking, the number of Palestinians killed versus Israelis, and shocking because the way you hear it, you would think it's all Israelis dying and no Palestinians, but there's absolutely no equivalence whatsoever on this issue. The only people making an equivalence basically is the United States and a few other, U.S. clones around the world who just lie. The U.S. ambassador to Israel, Tom Nides, of course, just doing the usual thing, saying that they stand by Israel's right to defend itself. And of course, we also know that Lloyd Austin, I think, was recently there and this issue came up and all these other issues. So, really covering themselves in anything other than glory, quite frankly. And this also comes, of course, as there's been an increase in the brutality against people in the West Bank. Really the apartheid system in Israel just, it's always been terrible, but just the vice just tightening and tightening and tightening and tightening. And obviously we know why, because the goal is to try to get Palestinians who they don't kill to leave and to never want to come back so that they can depopulate them in the same way they did in 1948, which is exactly why, Rania, the Zionist forces went on such an insane campaign against the Netflix movie about the Nakba, because they don't want anybody anywhere to know that there was a massive ethnic cleansing campaign in 1948 where whole villages were either massacred and forced out. They're not separate things, basically happening at the same time. I used to have this map, I wish I still had it, that actually showed the villages that had been depopulated, many of which no one even lives there now. I mean, so it's just they just cleaned the whole land, cleansed the whole area, this whole area of Israel, Palestine, and now they want everyone else to leave. The level of disrespect that was shown during Ramadan at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which, if anybody did anything like that, at the Western Wall or any of these other places, and rightfully so. People should not be desecrating religious areas of any religion, from my point of view. But it's just totally allowed in the context of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is obviously one of the most holy sites in Islam, that these Israeli thugs, so-called police, can just do whatever they want at any time. They bring in these other thugs, these settlers. They can do whatever they want at any time and against all rules. And unfortunately, the so-called guardians of Al-Aqsa Mosque are so in bed with the Israelis in the United States, they don't do anything about it. And that's Jordan and the royal family of Jordan, which has never really done anything on this issue, despite claiming to represent Palestinian issues in the West Bank, especially. But anyway, I don't want to get too into Jordan because it's really not them; it's Israel that's the main problem here. But really, just disgusting situation yet again.
Horrible. And, I would also add that, there's, of course, no equivalence between one Israeli dying versus 29 Palestinians. But I would also argue there's no moral equivalence here, in the sense that, like what you just described, you have a settler colonial apartheid state that is erasing a people for being the wrong religion, right? The indigenous people have been under attack nonstop since before 1948. Their land has been stolen. I mean, 80% of the people in Gaza are refugees or the descendants of refugees. So people who were ethnically cleansed from other areas of Palestine back in 1948. And they're stuck in this open air ghetto. And then they're condemned whenever they fire back against their oppressors. And then you'll have people make really silly statements on like Twitter, just being like, why do Palestinians have to use violence? Well, I mean, what do you want them to do? Just submit and take it lying down? Like, it doesn't make any sense to me. Israel's got a right to defend itself. Israel's got a right to defend itself. What about Palestinians? Do they have no right? I mean, every single day, they are subjected to horrific levels of violence, because in order for Israel to maintain the demographic majority that it wants to maintain, it has to commit brutal acts of horrific atrocities every hour of every day. And they say that quite openly in Israel. So I'm not sure like what people expect from Palestinians. I mean, they do peacefully protest. They peacefully protest and they get their knees shot and their kids get killed. They sit in, they get shot. They get tear gas, they get killed. So, I mean, I don't know what else they're supposed to do. And they're up against this massive military machine that is armed by the most powerful country in the world, the United States, that is completely like immune from any level of accountability by the US and the Europeans. And all they have to fight with is rocks. I mean, they literally get shot and killed for throwing rocks at occupying forces and illegal settlers. So yeah, I mean, the entire narrative around this situation is just so absurd the way it's covered in the US mainstream. And it's incredibly infuriating. Every time this takes place, we have to watch the entire media apparatus of the United States, as well as US officials, just completely dehumanize Palestinians for their mere existence. Like their message to Palestinians is just stop existing. Because at some point, Palestinian existence to Israel is like an act of terrorism. So I'm not sure what they expect or want them to do. And what's so shameful and disgraceful is the fact that Shireen Abu Akleh, not that this should matter, no matter, even if she wasn't American, it's outrageous that she was killed doing her job, being a journalist. But the fact that she's American and the Americans have done nothing to hold Israel accountable for murdering one of their own citizens while she was acting in the capacity of a journalist. I mean, talk about, fighting for freedom and democracy and protecting your people. Like, it's just completely shameful.
No, it is. It is. And on the issue of nonviolent resistance, I would encourage people to look up a guy named Issa Amro, who is a well-known nonviolent activist there, who was recently assaulted while in the company of a New Yorker journalist. That's why the video went viral. But when people say, like, why can't they be nonviolent? Well, I really think you should watch this video, because this is the person who has made his entire career on, some people call him the Palestinian Gandhi. And I know there's a lot of contradictions around that. But the point being, like, this is someone who is like 100%, I'm like, Gandhian, Martin Luther King, nonviolence. He's with a reporter from the New Yorker. Like, you couldn't be any more mainstream in the U.S. mainstream. And these I don't know if it was cops in the military, same thing over there, just like attack him brutally on the street. Look up what happened. Go to the Norwegian, Refugee Council, who recently put out something for a school that they support that, just a school for kids, was flattened because the Israelis decided they want to take the land, and now those students are forced to learn basically in the open air under a tent. No reason whatsoever. And this is like the official, I think NRC is officially associated with the government of Norway, but even if it's not, this is like one of the most well-known sort of, refugee assistance organizations, also powerless in the face of this. And I think that speaks to the point that you're making right now, or you just made, Ronnie, that I think is so important, is that the complicity of the U.S. government in the Israeli apartheid, they know they can do whatever they want to do, because there is really nothing can happen to them, because they know the U.S. will protect them. I mean, we're talking a lot about the International Criminal Court recently. Well, it's worth noting that even though the U.S. is not a party to the International Criminal Court, they were trying to essentially negotiate with them, to say, like, don't ever go after Israel, and we'll try to, like, find different ways to help you in different ways. So, I mean, at every single level, diplomatic, cultural, social, BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, totally peaceful, totally nonviolent. And you have states here in the United States violating our U.S. Constitution in order to try to ban that. And of course, our friend of the show here, Abby Martin, who with the Empire Files put together the great movie Gaza Fights for Freedom, of course, took these people to court in the state of Georgia and was able to defeat this issue. But I mean, it really is amazing. She was just trying to show a film, basically, but because of her own support for BDS and because it was at a state university, they tried to ban it. So, I mean, on every level, it's just, it's infuriating, I think. And for those of us who've been watching this for so many years, I mean, not to mention Palestinians themselves, you just feel like, what is going on? Because everyone in the world is so aware of this, but because the U.S., political system, and when you talk about Shireen Abu Akleh, I'm sure you remember very well, Rania, the tortured attempts by Ned Price to avoid saying the truth, that it was obvious that she was assassinated deliberately by this Israeli. Everyone, even the New York Times is reporting it, and he's, dancing around it. I mean, there's so many shameful things done by the U.S. government day in and day out, but and I want to rank them, like, there's no hierarchy of oppressions, but I do have to say that this just is such a uniquely shameful black mark on the U.S. government and all those who don't speak out, who have positions of power, these Congress people and others, including, by the way, the chair of the Democratic leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, who is from right here in New York, from Brooklyn, New York, who actually got up at a pro-Israel rally, and this is not fake, this is true, and paraphrased George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama. He gets up and he says, that, I forget the exact phrase, but Israel today, Israel tomorrow, Israel forever, which of course was echoing George Wallace's famous segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever speech. This is a black person. Anyway, we leave our next guest waiting for 30 minutes if I got into that, but it just shows you how deep of a complex that exists here, that someone would paraphrase George Wallace. Unbelievable.
Well, he's just sucking up to he's just sucking up to New York politics. That's what he's doing when he says that. I mean, maybe he actually believes that, but it is a testament to the fact that was paraphrasing George Wallace of what Israel actually means and stands for, and it's apartheid and segregation.
That's true.
So it actually works quite well, Israel today is basically saying segregation today, segregation tomorrow, so it's actually quite fitting.
Yeah, standing in the schoolhouse door. Well, why don't we turn our attention to India, which, by the way, has a very strong relation with Israel as well, where there's a continuation, ongoing right-wing campaign in the politics there. There's so much I could say here, so let's just get right into it. We are very, very honored to be joined here by Suchitra Vijayan, who is an author, lawyer, and the founder and director of the Polis Project. Suchitra, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I wanted to start here because this movie, I guess you could call it, the Kerala story, came to my attention, which has essentially is trying to say that the state of Kerala is the center of this love jihad campaign, that there's 32,000 women who were tricked to join ISIS. I mean, it's hard to even know where to start. So, I mean, maybe just explain this concept that has been really mainstreamed in India around this issue of allegedly people being, I don't even know, forcibly converted. I don't even know how to describe it.
I think you have to really base all of this in what's been happening in India since 2014. In 2014, you have Prime Minister Narendra Modi's right-wing Hindu Nationalist Party coming to power. He gets elected again in 2019. This is not to say that India was a paradise for minorities before, but what you really see since that time is a systematic and ongoing attempt to criminalize dissent, but also demonize, dehumanize the vast majority of Muslims in India. And one of the things that they've done is take this idea of love jihad, where they believe that Muslim men are here to convert Hindu women in this way. And then, again, all of this, India is on constitution a secular nation. You should be allowed to love who you want. But it's part of a series of things that have been happening. One, of course, is a law like the national, the citizenship laws, which again meant to create a registry and also strip minorities of citizenship rights. Love jihad is seen as this sense where you have this boogeyman of Muslim men trying to convert Hindu women. The other part of this, of course, are again laws that prevent Muslim men and Hindu women or interracial, interfaith couples from getting together. So this is a part of a much larger boogeyman and dog whistle, which is aimed at the Muslim community. Now, the film itself is a part of a large propaganda missionary that the state has set in, wherein they claim that initially they said 32,000 Hindu girls were forcibly taken, converted, and were now in Syria. The reality is, if you look at the numbers, the US Department of State says only 62 people from India left to fight and join IS, the Islamic State. The Indian government's own numbers are only somewhere between 100 and 200. So what this really is a propaganda film. When they took this film and the director to court, they agreed to remove the 32,000. And then the director actually said, oh, numbers don't mean anything. This is a story of 3 women. But what you've really seen is that all film can be argued in some level as propaganda. But the issue here is that the prime minister of the country is now using this film during the recent election campaigns. Something very similar happened with another movie called Kashmir Files, where again, these propaganda movies that are taking fact, replacing them with fiction and fake news is now being promoted. But what is really important is to realize that the Indian government is now 100% behind this story, and they're funding. These films have been given no tax status, which means that the local state doesn't have to give them tax. So it really is the entire machinery of the state now backing for what is, for all purposes, propaganda.
And then also, where does the issue of specifically, obviously attacking this particular area of India, like where does the issue of right versus left fit into here?
I mean, I think India, like all of South Asia, is so complex and diverse that history and memory and politics is so local. And I would really not make larger generalizations. But the south of India, especially Kerala and Tamil Nadu, are seen as pretty much the last of the bulwark against what is right now a right-wing government kind of sweeping across the country. So Kerala is... You see a society that is incredibly progressive. It has a high literacy rate. It's a community and society that has Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and many, many people of faith living together. It has a communist government in power, which is consistently prioritized social welfare. So what you're really seeing is the propaganda to demonize these states. And of course, this is not to say that these state governments are perfect. I think we have to critique all states when they do mistakes. But Kerala and Tamil Nadu, especially these two states, are seen as pretty much the places that are bulwark against what is very much a right-wing Hindu nationalist government in the center trying to push these ideologies onto the state.
I was hoping you could talk also a little bit more about political prisoners and some of the issues that are going on there. I mean, I know some people may be interested know about Umar Khalid's case and others who were, around the world. But I mean, it really does seem that the use of lawfare has really skyrocketed here under the BJP government.
You're absolutely right. Again, I want to be very clear that the BJP is not the first government to do this. India has had these issues for a really long time. But what we've really seen under the BJP is what the previous governments did in the shade of the night, the BJP now does in broad daylight. So we have a series of laws in India that are very similar to the Patriot Act that was put in, like the UAPA, which are pretty much draconian, which means that any individual can be arrested without proof, without evidence, and can be detained without trial for many years, merely based on the accusations of the state for being a terrorist and anti-national, or for again, the sedition laws, the treason laws. And these laws themselves have been called draconian, unlawful, unconstitutional by many people around the world. This includes legal scholars, UN bodies, rights organizations. Now, they have weaponized these laws to go after all kinds of dissenting voices. This is your lawyers, your activists, your journalists, some of India's most eloquent voices that were on the front line of fighting against the Indian state and on behalf of people like the Dalits, Muslims, Adivasis. Many of them have been now put in prison. Another set of people who have been put into prison are mostly young Muslim students, activists, and scholars. Again, many of them who have been resisting the Indian state. So what you really see is the collusion of the state, the law enforcement, the judiciary, all coming together to criminalize dissent in ways that I don't think anyone quite understands how dire the situation on the ground is.
Speaking of how dire the situation on the ground is, I've had, I don't think that people understand the severity of just how dangerous Modi and his BJP party are. I have, Indian friends of mine just like have their own sort of like anecdotal things to say about when they go back home and visit, and how they see like BJP community centers popping up around their villages or towns that weren't there even just a few years ago, and just how much this ideology is proliferating. Why is this so dangerous?
I think you have to understand that BJP's ideological fountainhead is the RSS, which takes its inspiration from the Italian fascists. I mean, again, this is something that has been well documented. They genuinely believe in fascist ideologies that were discussed by the Italian and the German fascists. They really do believe in this idea that India is not a secular nation, but indeed a Hindu majoritarian state, and that is a state that they want. Along with this comes this idea that there can only be one kind of an Indian citizen who's Hindu, who is Hindi speaking. But what it really does is it just wants to flatten out the diversity and difference in India. Along with it comes hatred towards anybody who is not Hindu. It's also deeply casteist, which means that India has a caste system, which also means that within the hierarchy, it's not just the Muslims, but I think Dalits, Adivasis again face discriminate violence, and they have so for a very long time. But with the BJP government, what you really see is an escalation of all of these differences that are just making it worse. In addition to that, the country's economy hasn't been doing very well. So what you really see is violence that is enacted in every single way, hate speech. Along with that, what the real crisis comes from the fact that now institutions like the judiciary that were supposed to, in some ways, be, interpreting laws in favor of the citizens have now, for all purposes, increasingly become an extended arm of the state.
I'm really glad you brought up the issue. Sorry about that. I'm really glad you brought up the issue of the economy, because I'm sure you saw Mr. Fareed Zakaria recently on his show on CNN. He said, I've come back from India and, I've never been more excited about what's happening in India. The economy's booming. The Wall Street Journal had the front page article, India is becoming, the next big manufacturing hub. So, and of course, Modi himself saying we're going to have this $40 trillion economy, all these other pieces. So, I mean, there's so much economic boosterism. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, the other side of that story, perhaps.
I think I would have to start by saying that Mr. Fareed Zakaria got everything wrong. I think he's gotten things wrong for a very long time, and I really hope people hold him accountable Of course. um, the idea that development for few is what is good for the rest is the biggest. It's the biggest. Excuse my French, but it's the biggest bullshit, and it's a lie that is being sold to us over and over again. You see that in the United States, you see it everywhere. Somehow, the idea that if the capitalist class is happy, somehow everything else is going to trickle down. The only thing that trickles down is violence. It's not the economy. What you really see in the economy, and again, Mr. Zakaria, after is eloquent misinformation, the last 20 seconds chooses to talk about what's happening to minorities. And I think violence and lack of dignity to over 200 million Muslims in India should not be a footnote. Human dignity is the most important thing, not so much your economic growth. What do you do with economic growth when there is no human dignity? In terms of India's economic growth, I think it's very important for us to understand that the government of India no longer keeps the right kind of information, data, or statistics. We've seen concerns raised by global organizations, especially economic organizations, economists saying that we do not know if we can believe the stats and the data that the Indian government is now putting forward in front of all of us. They did that with COVID. They do it with all kinds of numbers. So we really don't know what numbers we're supposed to rely on. For instance, the survey on poverty has been pushed. So because, again, we do not know what the number is. What you really see is this idea of fake news and disinformation is not just around dehumanizing Muslims and other minorities, it's also around India's growth story. Prime Minister Modi came to power on the idea that India had something he had built as a chief minister of Gujarat, the Gujarat model, which was highly acclaimed as this growth model. Now, almost a decade later, we know that growth was there was no growth. What you really saw was a few people become the victors who got the benefit, while the entire state's institutions were eroded. So I think the growth story really needs a little bit more. I think we need to think about this in the much broader scheme in terms of employment. 2 men in India today have more wealth and whose wealth has risen in the last 5 years, more than half of the country's population. Wow. The economic growth, the number of women leaving the workforce is a number that we know is increasing. We know that the demographic dividend, the number of young people without jobs, is just increasing. So no, I think what the ground reality is that India is heading towards a place where the economic growth might not be what the government says it is.
Mm-hmm. And, one more thing I wanted to ask you, during the recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, the issue of Kashmir sort of flared up again, but, I think it was just sort of the geopolitics of it. And, this long-running issue across many Indian governments, one of the, I hate to say it's a hidden issue. Obviously, it's known to many millions of people, but I think in the West, very, very unknown. So I was hoping you could just say a little bit about that as well, because I think the sort of the treatment meted out to Kashmiri people over the years is an important aspect also of this story about civil liberties and human rights in India.
I think what, as you guys are talking about Israel as a settler colonial state, India is a settler colonial state in Kashmir. But you will never hear the word settler colonial state refer to India, because India still has this immense global respect and regard as the world's largest secular democracy. But in reality, you have to understand that Kashmiris have been denied a voice for over 70 years. Often the Kashmir conflict is framed as a battle between India and Pakistan, while Kashmiri voices themselves are often just completely erased. Of course, that is changing. You have some incredible Kashmiri scholars who are now beginning to have a larger platform in places like the United States. But in reality, with the revocation of Article 370, the digital siege where Kashmiris were silenced for almost 6 months after the revocation for 370 with no access to internet or phones. And now, of course, you're seeing the land grab that is happening. What India really is doing in Kashmir is an act of violent settler colonial implementation of violent settler colonial policies. To call it anything else is just I don't know what else one calls it. And again, these stories are often framed as a conflict between two nation states and not the dignity of the Kashmiri people and their right to self-determination.
So,
I'm
sorry, go
actually,
ahead,
oh,
Rania.
sorry, no,
No,
Eugene,
please.
if it's a follow-up. Oh,
No, no,
well,
no,
I
no.
was going to ask, this is not to, we could do this all day. Not to centralize the US here, but I am a bit curious if these politics, because obviously there's a huge Indian diaspora in the US. Do these politics play out among the Indian American community here in the US? I mean, I'm Arab American, and a lot of those politics end up playing out sometimes in really nasty ways. So yeah, I'm curious if there's a parallel.
I think there is. I think I think there is increasingly a divide between the Indian diaspora. A lot of the Indian diaspora happen to be upper caste Hindu. A lot of them are supporters of Narendra Modi. When Modi was here last time with Trump, there was a huge gathering called Howdy Modi, where both Trump, we had two authoritarian leaders joining hands on the stage. Prime Minister Modi enjoys immense support in the diaspora. And what is quite interesting for me is that many of us who are immigrants to this country frame ourselves as immigrants, as people of color, to be protected, to benefit from the liberal values that the United States offers us. And yet, we are happy to talk about align ourselves with the benefits of the civil rights movements in this country, and yet have no problem with the Hindu nationalist government back in India targeting minorities back home. The hypocrisy of that is something that is unbelievable. Increasingly, you see the South Asian community demanding representation and equity, and they should. Everybody should be represented. But what is the value of the representation if you seek one values in the United States where you want to be treated with humanity and dignity and equality, but you refuse the same to those back home and support a regime that is systematically putting in place a system that is discriminating others? So there is a lot that's happening within the Indian diaspora. Recently, just today, there was California passed caste as a protected category. And you can see that a lot of Indians were not happy about it. They actually felt that this was another way of discriminating them. So yeah, there are many fights and cleavages within the diaspora, and it's only going to get more heated in the next few years.
Suchitra Vijayan, founder and director of the Polis Project, we really appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the freedom side and helping to pull back the veil on some of this.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I mean, for people who don't really follow India closely, I have to tell you it's very, very scary situation there, and people of Muslims, communists, socialists, liberals, journalists. I mean, it really, and Suchitra just spoke to it, but I mean, it really is a grind. And, you know, even many of the friends of ours here at Breakthrough News have been caught up in this ridiculous dragnet there. So hopefully something people continue to pay close attention to and don't fall for this propaganda that is out there about Modi. And I know that many of us, you know, we're looking at the multipolar world, we're looking at these other issues, we're looking at the role India is playing vis-a-vis Russia in this conflict. But I don't think we can lose track of the fact that, you know, there are geopolitical realities, but I mean, the things that are going on there are not pushing the world in the direction we want to go, you know, in terms of making things more just and more fair. So I really appreciate that piece. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
I was waiting. I'm like, I can jump in.
I'm good.
The sentence didn't have a period at the end.
Yeah. Well, people who know me know that I follow India closely. It's near and dear to my heart. So just a little pause there. But we want to turn now to another country very much under the gun. That is Syria. Big things happening there, though, as normalization or some degree of it with the other parts of the Arab League are starting to happen here. And we are very honored to be joined here by Giorgio Caffaro. Sorry if I said that wrong. CEO of Gall State Analytics. Giorgio, thank you so much for being with us.
It's an honor to be with you guys. Thank you.
Well, it's an honor to have you here. And maybe just to start here, maybe explain for those who just haven't seen, you know, what is happening between Syria and the Arab League? Like, what does it mean that Syria has been readmitted and so on?
Yeah, well, a few days ago, Syria regained full-fledged membership in the Arab League, a pan-Arab body that in the 1940s, Syria was one of the 6 members of. It was 11.5 years ago at an early stage of the Syrian crisis when the institution kicked out Syria, suspending the country's membership. And now for a number of years, analysts have been not really asking if Syria will come back to the Arab League, but it's been a question of when this development will happen. So this news from May 7th about Syria returning to the body really came as no surprise. It's important to realize that there are some countries in the Arab League that have been very active in their efforts to bring Syria back into the Arab League. But what I think really enabled this development to happen was Saudi Arabia changing its stance toward Damascus. Up until earlier this year, Saudi Arabia maintained its position that Assad had no legitimacy, in that Syria should not be brought back into the Arab fold. But there were 2 main developments that sort of pushed Saudi Arabia toward this position in favor of renormalizing relations with Damascus. First, in February, we had the horrific earthquake in southern Turkey and northern Syria. And then also there was the diplomatic agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And those were the 2 developments that did a lot to accelerate Saudi Arabia's movement toward this position that the Assad regime needs to be dealt with diplomatically and brought back into the region's diplomatic fold. And sort of within that context, I think Saudi Arabia used its leverage and its influence in the Arab League to either push the members to be in favor of letting Syria back in, and to also tell the countries like Kuwait, Morocco, and Qatar that were opposed to it, not that they had to abandon their stances against Assad, but to at least not get in the way of Syria returning.
And Giorgio, I'm curious. Well, first of all, I wanted to just say, and I don't know if you have anything to add to this, but there also does seem to be this belief, at least in the surrounding countries around Syria, that they host a lot of Syrian refugees. A lot of the money that's been promised by donor countries in the past to deal with that issue is no longer coming through. And of course, a lot of these countries will take the money that comes through for refugees and skim some of it off for politicians in those countries. But if money's not coming in anymore, much of which has been attributed to a lot of that money going towards the war in Ukraine. A lot of these European countries, used to cover the sort of refugee issue around Syria, and now they're not so much. So there's the issue of, at least in Lebanon, for example, wanting to send the Syrians back because we're not making money off of them anymore. So there's that aspect of it. But also, there is a spoiler role here, too, that I'd like to ask you about, and that is the role of the United States. It was interesting to watch. The U.S. seemed to have almost no control whatsoever over any of its allied states in the region to get them to oppose this measure. And they seem pretty upset about that. And so what we're seeing now is this bill has been presented in Congress. It's a bipartisan bill to basically ban the U.S. government from ever recognizing Assad as Syria's president, and to basically enhance the sanctions, the Caesar sanctions that have already been so destructive for Syria. I'm curious if you can talk a bit about the conversation in Washington, D.C., and if they can even really do anything to stand in the way of this.
Yeah, well, in Washington, there's a consensus on both sides of the partisan divide that the U.S. should try to pressure Arab states into not renormalizing relations with Syria. And this development about Syria returning to the Arab League was something that obviously infuriated so many people in Washington. I think it's important, though, to draw a distinction between Arab states reopening embassies in Damascus, welcoming Assad and Syrian officials to their capitals, and putting out favorable toward the regime. That's mostly symbolic stuff, and the Caesar Act doesn't really address that. It's also about investing in Syria, signing trade deals with Syria, doing business with entities in Syria, and that's where the Caesar Act definitely comes in. I think when it comes to these symbolic moves, the U.S. definitely does not like to see this happen, but my personal view is that Washington will not really do much about it beyond issuing angry statements and having heated rhetoric. But if we were to see some Arab states put money into Syria, I think that obviously raises these important questions about the Caesar Act. And so far, these very crippling sanctions.
Uh-oh.
Obviously, no.
You're a little frozen there, Giorgio. We're going to see if we
Yeah.
can get him back there. You're making a very important point about the impact of the Caesar sanctions there, and to the extent the Gulf states move in. I don't want to preempt him whatsoever, so we'll just hold on that point as he comes back. But just note, from a news perspective, President of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, recently there in Syria, and of course the ongoing negotiations happening right now in Moscow between Turkey and. Between Turkey and Syria around some of the issues there, right on time for the elections in Turkey that are, wow, there's just a huge crash where I am, sorry, which are this Sunday, I think, the 14th. Here, I don't even know. I was going to say something about the Turkish elections and I just lost it because I don't know. Hopefully no one's dead or anything. But Sunday,
I'm curious,
May 14th is the Turkish elections.
I'm curious which BT News person is responsible for that noise.
Well, this maybe is a reason to donate because we could have, I don't even know, like workers' comp to pay out or something. Someone could be trapped.
It sounds
falling,
pretty horrible.
Cabinet.
A grenade go off over there? Like, what is happening?
I don't know.
Sounds kind of like a grenade went off inside a
Turkish
filing
elections.
cabinet.
I don't know. Maybe that's just like the world saying something about Turkey. I think we have Giorgio back on here.
Let's see.
Yep.
I'm so sorry about that. Excuse me, I'm someplace where the internet connection is probably awful. That's my fault. And I'm sure the horrific sound came from my side. I'm not sure.
No. It definitely was not your side. But you were making a point about sanctions in the Gulf states. I'm actually, Eugene was also, while we didn't have you for a moment, made a couple other compelling points that I'd like to get your take on too, because you do cover a lot of these issues. And when we talk about the reintegration of Syria in the Arab League, and you mentioned the role of Saudi Arabia and the importance of Saudi Arabia essentially reestablishing relations with Syria, which was, a pretty significant thing. There's so much happening in the region right now. You had the Saudi-Iran deal. You also have Moscow overseeing a potential detente or peace deal of sorts between Turkey and Syria, which is quite important. There's, what's happening in Yemen. It seems as though so much is shifting in the region so quickly in what I think is a very positive direction, with China and Russia playing pretty essential roles. And what seems so in your face here is almost like the absence of the U.S. I mean, obviously the U.S. is still very present in the region, but how significant are all these shifts when we talk about the sort of rise of China and Russia to some extent, and the U.S. moving maybe a bit away from the Middle East?
Well, I think it's very significant. At previous points in history, when power was much more concentrated in the U.S. and there was a much more hegemonic order, pretty much all the major diplomatic breakthroughs that took place in the Middle East, at least at some point, went through Washington. So the March 10 diplomatic agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, this was brokered by China, and then Iraq and the Sultanate of Oman played important roles in it too. But as you correctly point out, Washington was completely absent from that. And that really speaks to the reality of a much more multipolar world where the US is obviously still a very influential actor, but it's not nearly as influential as it was years ago, decades ago. And also when we're talking about, Syrian normalization, the Russians in brokering this diplomatic engagement between the Saudi and the Syrian governments, completely leaving the United States out of it. I think in general, when we're talking about Arab states renormalizing their relations with Damascus, they've basically that when it comes to Syria, the US policies have failed. And many of these Arab governments have no love for Bashar al-Assad and his regime. The Saudis certainly do not love the Syrian government. whatsoever. But their view is that this U.S. approach of trying to basically give Syria what I call the North Korea treatment, just trying to isolate the country, sanction the country, treat it as a so-called rogue regime, that's not going to lead to anything positive for the region. And for all the problems they have with Assad's government, their assessment is that it's in their interest to engage Damascus and deal with the reality of the Syrian government's survival. And this is something that the U.S. hates to see happen. But when I talk to officials and analysts who are in GCC countries in Egypt, the view is, look, America is a North American country on the other side of the world. These countries in the GCC and Egypt and Jordan, they're in the neighborhood, and they have to deal with the reality of what's going on in Syria today. And they've decided that the U.S. pressure to isolate Syria is something that they're going to ignore. I think to bring this one step forward and look a little bit ahead to the future, it's going to be important, though, to see how they deal with the Caesar Act. Right now, the Caesar Act has resulted in the wealthy Gulf Arab states not really putting money into Syria. And they're obviously concerned about the secondary sanctions. One of the important questions that I think we need to ask is, how much longer is the Caesar Act going to deter them from pursuing their interests in Syria? In Abu Dhabi, you have leadership that really wants to assert their in the United States. And I think we consider them in Saudi Arabia at some point deciding to just ignore the Caesar Act and defy the U.S. here.
Mm-hmm. Well, Georgie, we might have lost you a little bit there, but
it's whenever he talks with the Caesar Act, I think there's like some sort
you could say we're being sabotaged here. Well,
yeah.
Either way, I'll say this: Giorgio Cafero, CEO of Gulf State Analytics. I appreciate you joining us and helping us unveil this whole thing. We'll have to have you back here on the show to keep talking about it as things move forward. But thanks for illuminating a little bit of it for us. I'm sure he's
probably saying thanks for having me.
Person.
Yeah, I'm 100%. It seems very polite. Yes,
very polite, very nice guy, very knowledgeable person. We'll definitely bring him back. But dropping a lot of important knowledge there, I think, especially about deeds and words. Like it's one thing to say they're back in, and it's interesting when you look at the Syrian response. It's been pretty muted. They've been like, oh yeah, we're happy, but they're obviously like, let's see what this really means. But I think it also speaks to the overall issue of why they isolated Syria in the first place, because, for people who don't know, Syria was not just some like side country in the Arab League, but, since the founding of the Arab League has really helped shape the agenda for the Arab world. And of course, the role of Syria, and sort of unknown role, by the way, that many people don't know, is after 9/11, Syria did a lot of key diplomatic work at the United Nations to prevent the Bush administration from extending some of the things they wanted against the Palestinians under the guise of fighting al-Qaeda. It's a kind of an unknown history, but an interesting diplomatic dance that they were able to pull together there. So, historically, they've used their role in the Arab League to help shape the agenda for the region, and I think not in the way the U.S. would want, hence why they were so happy to try to get rid of them in the context of the Arab Spring at that time. But yeah, it's going to be very, very interesting to see here. I think there's probably a lot more Assad memes out there. The "Who Must Go" meme.
The laughing Assad, yeah. The laughing Assad meme. I will say, for those who do want to learn more about like the trajectory, the history of the U.S. isolation of Syria, and really economic warfare and actual warfare on Syria, check out my episode from a few weeks back with Greg Shupak, who went over that with me on Dispatches.
Yes.
About that very topic. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, hopefully we will see some, lifting of these sanctions, which, you can't stress enough. And I know you've been to Syria, you've been to different places. It's like no rich person is being hurt by sanctions. They just get even richer because, the limited ability to bring things into the country mean that a handful of people are able to form these monopolies. In every sanctioned country, this happens, or not all of them maybe, but many of them. And they become even richer than they ever did before because they're able to use this leverage. It's the average everyday people, the working class people, the people living in rural areas, the people in hospitals. Those are the people who are suffering happening here. So anyone who thinks like, oh, we're really getting one over on this country or that country, trust me, you are not. You're only really destroying people's lives.
Exactly. And it's not up to the United States who gets to be in charge of Syria. Like Syria is not a state of the United States. It doesn't belong to the US. Like it's just the arrogance of the US dictating to an entire region who they can and cannot normalize with is just, it's really absurd, and it should infuriate you for all the people who constantly talk about, oh, sovereignty this, sovereignty that. Well, this region, the Middle East, should have sovereignty. All these countries who are deciding to normalize with their neighbor, Syria, are allowed to do that. And the US should not be able to stand in the way of that. And the fact that they're reacting in this really like immature way just shows how they've actually, like what Giorgio said, their policy on Syria has been an absolute failure. And all they have left is to like pass a law in the US that the US isn't going to normalize with Assad. I mean, was that even ever going to happen anyway? Probably not.
Yeah, no, I
okay.
think, we talk so much about Africa in the context of the role of colonialism and creating and exacerbating the tensions between people. But let's also remember, in the wake of World War I, the same thing was done in West Asia, and deliberately, some of these fake countries like Kuwait, I'm sorry, but I just have to say it, no disrespect, I guess, to any Kuwaiti who loves this show. But
the Kuwaiti foreign minister is on.
Yeah, they sat around the Sykes-Picot Agreement and just decided this is going to be this is going to be that, this is going to be that. This person in charge of this person in charge of that. I mean, the whole thing is set up this way. And when you go back and when you look at what these colonialist, imperialist types were saying, just like same thing they've said about Africa, just like they said about India too, by the way, what's now India and Pakistan and other South Asian states, is that they deliberately were using the strategy of divide and conquer because they knew there was no way they could hold down the subcontinent. There's no way they could hold down the Arab world. There's no way they could hold down the African continent unless they found a way to turn people against each other and get them fighting each other. And they did everything they possibly could, put all the little landmines and time bombs they could to make that possible. And it's not an accident that these things have ended up, in these ways. It's not just, what you read in the West, like, oh, they're just violent over there. How they always say about Sunnis and Shia. Well, it's been going on for 2,000 years. It's always these dumb Orientalist, explanations. But anyway.
Well, one thing I will mention, just because you brought it up before we move on to the next story here, is that you mentioned the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and actually May 9th, which was 2 days ago, was the anniversary of that very agreement. It was 1916. Yes. And it was basically the Berlin Conference equivalent, if you will, like chopping up the region after World War I.
Yeah. And I have to say, the movie Lawrence of Arabia gets it really wrong. So even if you like Peter O'Toole, trust me, that's not the true history. Well, we're going to turn here to a really critically important issue happening right now in the United States, and that is the issues going on around immigration, around the border. Obviously, today was the expiration of Title 42. We are very honored to be joined here on the show by Javier Guerrero, who is an organizer with the Answer Coalition. Javier, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, Eugene and Rania. Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, we are honored to have you here. And I guess, let me just start by asking you this. I mean, Title 42 has expired. I guess for people who maybe aren't following this, what does this really mean vis-a-vis the situation for migrants at the border?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to start with what Title 42 was. Title 42 was this really closing of the border, this guise that Trump era used to really close the border and stop the flow of migrants. So people seeking asylum, fleeing their countries because of destabilization, really brought forth by the U.S. Right? It was a way to use the COVID pandemic crisis to really basically close the U.S. southern border. And I think that now what we have now is the Biden administration's failure to really pass, not just the Biden administration, but every single administration prior to this, whether Democratic or Republican, to really pass what's needed, comprehensive immigrant reform that is really at the root of this issue, along with addressing U.S. imperialism and neoliberal policies in the area. So instead, Biden just let the clock run out on this, and here is what thousands of people at the border are going to face. They're going to face this head-on clash against the more than 3,500 now U.S. military personnel that are deployed there. I mean, it's nothing less but it's like if they're preparing for war instead of preparing to address an issue of people as I said, fleeing countries that ironically are fleeing because of U.S. policies of destabilization, of intervention, of imperialism, of neoliberalism in their homelands. I myself am a victim of this, coming from my homeland of Colombia, and it's just upsetting that they just been passing the buck for 2 decades now, and nothing has been done to curb this.
I mean, there's so much you mentioned there that I'm sure, Eugene wants to follow up on, and so do I. And I mean, one thing in particular I'd like to ask about is you mentioned, of course, like the massive sort of militarized border apparatus with all of the agents that are there. And of course, we know there's like a wall, and there's also this desert terrain that's like intended to push people through to make it so that they like actually have a very difficult time and die on their way trying to get to the US. And then if they do make it, they're often captured, and of course, like put into like private immigration or private like prison facilities, oftentimes, and then deported. On top of that, I think this has been happening for a long time, but we also have seen a lot of vigilante violence taking place lately when it comes to immigrants at the border, with people shot and killed by like ranchers in Texas, people being run over by cars. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between this massive border apparatus, the very anti-immigrant like propaganda we see in the media, and then this kind of like vigilante violence that seems to be on the rise, though it's been there for quite some time?
Yeah, I mean, this is very correlated. I think this is the hate created, right? This is the direct result of these policies, the direct result of not addressing. I mean, we saw violence really and accident and tragic in both sides of the border. I mean, just in the past 2 weeks, we saw this horrible mass shooting in the Texas mall that killed less than a dozen people. Aside from that, the other in Brownsville, which is another in Texas, another border city, we saw this person that ran a group of killed 9 Venezuelan immigrants outside of a migrant asylum in a state on the U.S. side of the border. I mean, this is all correlated with, this is the result of these white supremacists, of these racist, xenophobic laws that lead to violence on both sides. I mean, on the Mexican side, because of the concentration of thousands and thousands of immigrants coming from Central America, from Guatemala, from Nicaragua, from Venezuela, from Haiti, right? I was just on the border about 2 weeks ago, and that's something that you still see to this day. Hundreds of Haitians working along the border crossing for people that are crossing the border. Obviously, this is because of this concentration of people. There's been fires earlier in the month of March. In the end of the month of March, there was a fire that killed 40 people in Mexico, in an immigration center in Mexico, awaiting asylum, awaiting what's going to happen with Title 42. Tents that people put up along the border crossings have also caught on fire because so people, it puts both sides of the border in danger, to be honest.
I was hoping you already mentioned this, but you could talk a little bit more about the conditions that people are fleeing from, because it's just amazing to me that they say, well, these people are coming from Venezuela, they're coming from Cuba, they're coming from Haiti, as if it's just random that they're coming. I mean, and of course, they're also coming from Honduras, Guatemala, but the perception, as you know very well in the U.S. media, is that, I mean, like, these are criminals or whatever, that is just completely random, basically, that people are coming. So talk a little bit about, sort of that cause and effect issue, if you could.
Yeah, I mean, I think every elementary school kids know that every action has a reaction, right? I mean, I think it's always interesting how the debate about immigration always starts on this side of the border, right? But it's never asked, why are people coming? What is the true root of mass migration? And it really is directly related. And that's what I said, the U.S. imperialism through the use of sanctions, the use of military coups by supporting extreme right-wing governments in places like Guatemala and Central America, by putting sanctions in place in Venezuela, have completely led to the destabilization of the countries, have led to the choking of the Venezuelan economy, which has caused this migration crisis in Venezuela that the Venezuelan government has been really trying to recuperate and address, and has done many strides to really bring people back to the country. But this is really the destabilization that was caused. Right. I mean, people are fleeing poverty. People are fleeing, violence in Central America. I mean, the U.S. is directly responsible through the Contra wars, through the flow of migrants from Central America, and like I said, the support of multiple right-wing governments in places like Guatemala, in El Salvador. I mean, the president of El Salvador just his answer to crime in the country is to lock everyone up, right? And I think that's the destabilization. That is the violence that is being caused by U.S. neoliberal policies in these places. So people are fleeing that. They're fleeing. There being no jobs at home because U.S. transnational companies completely destroy the national economies of these countries. I mean, I'm from Colombia. My family came here in the early 2000s because of the signing of the free trade agreement that was signed by the Uribe government at the time, that led to masses and masses of Colombian peasants and workers who have to flee, to making places like Miami and New York and Chicago to be hubs of massive Colombian immigrants in the last 20 years. I mean, people always talked about Venezuelan migration, but they haven't talked about the millions of Colombians and people from other places leaving because of U.S. policy, neoliberal policies in the region. So I think that's really, and that's not where the story ends. Along the way, border through border, people face kidnappings. They face sexual abuse. They face homelessness. I mean, you just put your shoes put yourself in the shoes of these families. Why would you will never leave a place with your children and put them in danger if back home would not be safe. So I think that's really the issue. The debate never starts at that side and ask you what the real root cause of migration is.
And then, of course, there's the way that this issue of immigrants' rights shapes progressive politics in the U.S., right? I mean, the fact that this is something Eugene often mentions, and it is very important to note that, back in 2020 when Bernie Sanders was running for a second time, he won mainly in places where the Latino working class is the dominant voter bloc. And there is this fear of Democrats, that Democrats will embrace immigrants' rights, not only because of racists, but also I think within the Democratic Party itself, this fear that the issue of immigrants' rights does open up more space for progressive politics. You would think it would be actually really beneficial for Democrats to take on the issue of immigrants' rights and giving people citizenship, but it's almost like they're fearful of that, or at least the more right-wing elements of the Democratic Party are fearful of that because of where it might take the Democratic Party if they had suddenly all these progressive voters who had voted for Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Biden administration does a really good job of playing both sides, right? On one side, they pander to immigrants, saying that we're not evil as Trump, we're not those, we're here with open arms, and in turn, what they do is obviously lead to this crisis now that Title 42 is going to expire and you have nothing in place. But I think what you said is correct. I think regardless of what the Democrats or the Republicans do, immigrants and the people in the U.S. will really have the last word. I think that we show that, from the Bush administration when, the largest boycott or strike in U.S. history, a day without an immigrant, the Great American Boycott of 2006, really what that put May 1st and the labor movement back on the map, right? And then moving with the Bernie Sanders election, where Bernie Sanders really owes a lot of his success to the significant number of voters of immigrant families in places, especially in places where Latinos have a huge voting base. I mean, I think that, and I think what happens is they fear, just like after the uprising, after the murder of George Floyd, they fear that they might say that they are for police reform or whatever, police brutality reform, but instead they put more funding into the police. I think they don't want to open up the space to immigrant rights reform, and that's what they have been passing the buck for so many years and not addressing the issue. Because if you open up the space and if you pass progressive immigration reform, the people's conscience will go up and say, well, what do we want next, right? And I think that's the danger. So that's why they play both sides and instead cater to conservative voters also by militarizing the border literally and putting actually what many would say are stricter policies for people seeking asylum now. It's almost like a backdoor ban in many ways. So I think that's their fear. And then to be honest, but if you look at a history of U.S. And for people thinking that there is no solution to this, the U.S. has historically been over the time progressive with immigration policy. In particular, during the Reagan administration, there was an amnesty that was passed in 1996, granting millions of immigrants. They could do the same thing right now, but they don't want to because they're using immigration as a political tool to play both sides.
Well, Javier Guerrero, organizer with the Answer Coalition, we really appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Yeah, really unbelievable situation. I think the highest number of people ever right now are being held in immigration detention because so many people, are trying to get in here now before maybe it's too late. I think it's like 28,000. This is a really terrible situation. We do have some breaking news here. Daniel Penny, the 24-year-old former Marine who murdered Jordan Neely recently on the New York City subway via a chokehold, is expected to be charged and surrender as early as Friday. There are different I'm seeing actually different reports on what exactly the charges may or may not be, but either way, he's allegedly going to be charged here and surrender. They're not submitting it to a grand jury, so I think they're just going to go right ahead, and we will see what those charges will be. But of course, we'll continue to report that story, to the extent that we can here on Breakthrough News, but an important one to follow there. So an arrest being made in the murder of Jordan Neely of Daniel Penny, or I guess he'll turn himself in sometime in the
Took
next
a
24
while,
hours.
huh?
Took quite
while.
some time, despite
Usually
the fact that it was on
after-
video.
Yeah. Wow. Murder on video. And it took what, like 2 weeks?
Yeah.
Has it been 2 weeks?
It hasn't been too, well, yeah. It's been
Or
a
like
long time.
a week and a half or
Yeah,
something. It's
been
been,
a long
I
time.
mean, usually when you know who the murderer was,
Yeah.
they're arrested pretty quickly when it's blatant murder. So
Indeed.
surprising.
Indeed.
It should be shocking it took this long. And yeah, we'll have to wait and see what the actual charges are, because that will say a lot.
Well, this brings us to the end of our show here. Thank you so much for everyone for watching, of course. Very happy to have you. Rania, as always, it's a pleasure to be here alongside you. Anything you want to leave our viewers with here before we are off air?
Absolutely. If you haven't liked this episode on YouTube yet, please like it. It boosts us in the algorithm. I'm being nice today about that. Notice how
Yes.
very few times
Well, you shamed people earlier, so it's
I shouted at our
spice, I
audience.
guess.
Yeah. But no, and we do, of course, appreciate all that support. And another way you can support the show and also access exclusive content is by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthroughnews. We're always trying to grow and trying to get better. And the way we do that is with support from our viewers and our audience, because we aren't CNN. So we don't have like an endless supply of lots and lots of money to, do whatever we want anytime we want. So we do appreciate that support. And of course, you can always donate on YouTube. There's an option in most countries, at least, to donate. You can always donate to the live chat. But most importantly, to be a consistent supporter, patreon.com/breakthroughnews. Become a patron. You can access Eugene's monthly seminar in Africa. You can access the full episodes of my program Dispatches. And there's more exclusive content to come.
Patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Well, on behalf of our whole Breakthrough News team, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side. Thanks to all of our guests, of course, and everyone who donated. Shout out to F. Lou, who threw in a donation earlier. And as always, we will see you next time.